The story of the dwarves and their 7 rings in The Lord of the Rings is a fascinating and tragic tale. While Sauron's primary goal with the Rings of Power was to dominate the races of Middle-earth, the dwarves proved resistant to his direct control. But that doesn't mean the rings didn't have an impact on them. Instead of enslaving them like men, the rings amplified one of the dwarves' defining traits: their greed. Let's dive into how these rings worked and why they played such a pivotal role in the downfall of the dwarves. Long before the Rings of Power were created, the dwarves already had a reputation for their love of treasure. In Tolkien's writings, particularly in the First Age, their greed is well documented. One notable example is the story of the Noglamir, a necklace crafted by the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost for the elven king Finrod Felagund. Later, Elu Thingol, another elven king, asked the dwarves to set a silmaril, a jewel of immense beauty and power, into the necklace. But the dwarves became so entranced by the combined splendor of the Noglamir and the Silmaril that they refused to return it to Thingol. This act of greed led to conflict, and the dwarves killed Thingol in their pursuit of the treasure. This event didn't just show the dwarves' greed, but also highlighted how it could lead to disastrous consequences. It set the stage for their reaction to the Rings of Power. By the time Sauron forged the rings, the dwarves already had a strong desire for wealth and an inclination to hoard treasures. The rings didn't create this trait, they simply amplified it. Sauron's plan for the dwarves was ambitious. He hoped the 7 rings would allow him to dominate them just as he did with men, who became the Nazgul. But the dwarves proved more resilient than Sauron anticipated. Unlike men, they were not turned into wraiths, nor were they directly controlled by Sauron. Instead, the rings brought out the worst in them. The dwarves became more obsessed with riches, more ambitious in their mining efforts, and more willing to take dangerous risks to achieve their goals. Take the events of The Hobbit as an example. Thorin Oakenshield's descent into greed and obsession over the treasure of Erebor is a clear representation of this amplified flaw. The Arkenstone, a prized gem among the treasures of the Lonely Mountain, becomes the focal point of Thorin's fixation. His greed blinds him to reason, causing division among his allies, and ultimately leading to his tragic end. Although the story of The Hobbit doesn't explicitly mention the Rings of Power, Thorin's behavior echoes the kind of greed the rings brought out in the dwarves who wielded them.
Let us go under it! Let us go through the mines of Moria!
In the Rings of Power, we see this theme further explored through King Durin III and the Kingdom of Khazad-dûm. The series depicts Durin's relentless pursuit of wealth, which leads to the awakening of the Balrog deep beneath the mountain. While the Rings of Power were crafted with the intention of aiding the dwarves, their influence only pushed Durin further into his destructive ambitions. His greed, combined with the power of the rings, ultimately spelled disaster for Khazad-dûm.
The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep.
It's important to note that Sauron's original plan for the dwarves didn't fully succeed. While the rings amplified their greed, they didn't allow Sauron to control them directly. The dwarves' natural resistance to domination, a trait tied to their creation by Ollie the Smith, meant they couldn't be enslaved like men. The rings didn't make them invisible, nor did they turn them into wraiths. Instead, the dwarves experienced personality changes. Their love for treasure became an all-consuming obsession, leading them to isolate themselves and prioritize riches over the well-being of their people or the larger threats to Middle-earth. This isolation played right into Sauron's hands. While the dwarves weren't his direct servants, their greed caused division and weakened their kingdoms. They withdrew from the wider conflicts of Middle-earth, focusing solely on their treasures. As Elrond famously states in The Lord of the Rings, they hide in their mountains seeking riches. They care nothing for the troubles of others. This withdrawal made them vulnerable, and over time, many of their great kingdoms fell. The ultimate tragedy of the dwarves' story is that their downfall wasn't entirely due to outside forces.
You know what this dwarf says to that? Ishkakui, Aidorug.
The Rings of Power may have accelerated their decline, but the seeds of their greed were already present. From their earliest stories to their most recent struggles, the dwarves' love for treasure often came at a great cost. After the events of The Lord of the Rings, some efforts were made to restore the Dwarven kingdoms. Gimli, as the Lord of the Glittering Caves, helped rebuild some of their lost glory. But even then, the dwarves became less relevant during the Fourth Age, which was deemed the Age of Men. Their legacy, marked by both their incredible craftsmanship and their tragic greed, remains a central part of Middle-earth's history.
What's happening out there?
Shall I describe it to you? Or would you like me to find you a box?
The 7 rings didn't enslave the dwarves, but they amplified their weaknesses, making them more prone to greed and isolation. Their story serves as a reminder of how even the greatest strengths, like their unmatched skill in crafting and mining, can become flaws when taken to extremes. In the end, the dwarves' tale is one of resilience, tragedy, and the devastating effects of unchecked ambition.
Bomber!